Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are, everyone. Welcome to our next Race and Dialogue conversation. My name is Christopher Fletcher. I'm the Assistant Director of the Center for Renaissance Studies here at the Newberry Library in Chicago. I am thrilled to welcome you to today's installment of Race and Dialogue, a conversation series from our center that features cross-generational discussions between scholars of pre-modern critical race studies and critical indigenous studies. And I'm proud to share that we have now reached double digits. This is our 10th conversation in the series. So we're very excited to have you all with us for this milestone event. We are so honored to have two outstanding medievalists with us today. Andrea Achi from the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Bryan Keene from Riverside City College, both of whom have a wide range of experience sharing medieval art and culture with diverse audiences as curators, researchers, and educators. The theme for our conversation today, considering race in global medieval context, is a pressing one indeed, as more and more scholars of pre-modern studies look to broaden and decenter traditional narratives of the medieval past. We are looking forward to hearing Andrea and Bryan discuss the opportunities and challenges inherent in understanding and explaining how artists visualize people and communities in contact in the medieval world. We will put more information about them and their exhibitions and their publications in the chat, so please stay tuned for that during the conversation. Now, before they begin their conversation, I would like to read the Newberry Library's land acknowledgement. As part of our commitment to addressing the ongoing legacies of dispossession and settler colonialism, as well as our relationships with the city, the land, and the environment, the Newberry Library has written the following land acknowledgement in partnership with the Chicago American Indian Center. Located near the confluence of several waterways, the Newberry Library sits on land that intersects with the Aboriginal homelands of several tribal nations, the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe nations, the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria and Kaskaskia nations, and the Miamia, Wea, Thakiwaki, and Meskwaki nations. The Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Kickapoo, and Mascoutin nations also call the region of Northeast Illinois home. Indigenous peoples continue to live in this area and celebrate their traditional teachings and lifeways. Today, Chicago is home to one of the largest urban Indigenous communities in the United States, and this land remains an important place for Indigenous peoples. As a Chicago institution, it is the Newberry's responsibility to acknowledge this historical context and build reciprocal relationships with the tribal nations on whose lands we are situated. And wherever you currently are, since this is a virtual event, all our panelists and audience members, you're joining from different places. So wherever you are, we encourage you to learn how you may be of service to the people on whose lands you are situated and seek to understand your place within the history that has brought you to reside there. All right, with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Achi and Dr. Keene. Thank you both for being here. We are excited for the conversation. Just so the audience knows, we will start taking questions about 30 to 40 minutes into the conversation. Please feel free to submit questions to the Q&A button, which is located at the bottom of your screen at any time. And we look forward to that conversation later. But for now, Bryan and Andrea, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Christopher, and thank you everyone for joining this conversation. And it is so nice to see so many names of friends and colleagues today. I'm really grateful, and I'm also really grateful to be in conversation with you, Bryan, because you and I have worked together so many different types of projects over the past couple of years related to race in the medieval period, but then also thinking about our field broadly. And so thank you also for joining me today.
Thank you. Yeah, it's wonderful to be in conversation. I know as we were thinking about today's program, we were sort of thinking about all of those different spheres that we've interacted in over the last several years and thinking about the audience itself, as I see lots, as you've mentioned, friends, colleagues, and also a huge number of students that we see as well. So I think it might be helpful for our audience members to understand how we came to the fields that we're in and where those intersecting points are, and especially around the topics of race. So Andrea, I don't know if you'd like to start us off and share your journey, and then I'm happy to follow suit.
I'll be happy to start. So I started off as an ancient studies classics major in undergrad at Barnard College, and I actually thought I was going to get my PhD in classics or in Greek specifically. I really loved the process of translating languages, and so I started taking Latin when I was in seventh grade, and then I was just good at it, and I kept on going. And then when I was a senior at Bryan, I went on an excavation in Egypt to actually translate texts that were coming out of ground, so papyri and Mastrika, Greek text. But when I was on site and we were doing the translation process, I realized I was more interested in the materials that the texts were on, and then also the houses that we're excavating, and like the landscape, and then the people. And it was just like so many more things that were interesting to me beyond thinking about language itself. And so I told my advisor then, like, oh, I'm going to get my PhD in art history and archaeology now. And he told me, like, well, you're not qualified. Like you've been on this like language track and you can't do that. And so it was just interesting to think that like as a senior in college, I mean, that people could tell me like what I could do, right? And that was the whole world was my lobster right then, right? And so I decided to get a MA in archaeology, specifically thinking about late antique Egypt, and because the site that I was excavating was a late antique Egyptian site, and I was really interested in the ways in which that the Egyptians were thinking about themselves in late antiquities as part of the Roman and then the Byzantine Empire, but then also was thinking about at that time about the different races and ethnicities in Northern Africa and the communities along the Nile Valley. So not only Egypt, but then Sudan and Ethiopia. And so my senior thesis in undergrad was actually about Blacks in late antiquity. It was building on the work of Frank Snowden. And so I've been thinking about of race and identity really since my undergraduate career. And, I could go like on for an hour from, that moment to today, but I've always been, and I've come back to that topic in different ways. And so I wrote my dissertation at the Institute of Fine Arts on Coptic manuscripts, and I didn't think about race and ethnicity in that way at all, really. I was really focused on the illuminations and these medieval manuscripts from a Coptic monastery. But as I was finishing up the dissertation, I realized I was really looking at these manuscripts from a religious studies perspective, but then also almost like a Byzantine art historian's perspective, like how these like fit within Byzantine history, but not really African art history perspective. And I told my dissertation advisor at the time, Thelma Thomas, like, oh, well, maybe I should write a chapter about book productions in Africa and like how that these manuscripts fit in that. And she said, you know what, you just need to finish your dissertation and then maybe you can have an exhibition on this. And so when I started at the Met, I really was thinking about the state of Byzantine art in Africa and how to like make an exhibition about that, right? And I go what that might look like. And so when I started my position in 2018, I was really wanted to go with that idea. And so and it's just interesting that throughout my entire academic career, but then also my professional career, I've been thinking about these ideas in terms of the relationship between like these communities in Northern Africa and the broader medieval and Byzantine world. And so that's really how I got to where I am today. Overall. So that's specifically about my research interests. But then I also been thinking about, the state of our field, right? And like in terms of the practitioners and what our field looks like. And so I've been really interested in thinking about pipelines, making our field more diverse, making, like thinking about even diversifying like our syllabus and the types of things that students read as well. And I know you've been thinking about that as well, Bryan.
Yeah, what I'm noticing is those moments of overlap in our various careers. I also started with a linguistics background, was studying Romance languages, and was a sociology major and a criminology student. But then it was after studying abroad in Europe, in fact, being in the spaces, in the architectural spaces, really, in Spain and France and Italy, that piqued my interest more in the history behind the spaces. And it wasn't clear to me at that point as an undergraduate how the languages would be, of course, extremely useful long-term in my dissertation work, eventually, but also curatorial work, work in an education department, which is how I started in museums before moving into curatorial. And so language was a starting point. And then similar to you, thinking about manuscripts as the inroads to medieval studies, my dissertation was on choir book illumination in Florence in the 14th century, which was the sort of byproduct of a larger exhibition that the Getty mounted when I was a curatorial assistant under the direction of Christine Shaka. And that project that really centered technical analysis and conservation science with the art historical opened my eyes to the fullness of our fields in ways that I couldn't have foreseen even as an undergraduate student. And so I think even as you've been working towards thinking about pipelines, and it's something that I think about. I think for the students listening, it's the reminder that there are so many different pathways and there's no one single path, and that our fields overlap and intersect in so many interesting and important ways. The museum space has been an important one to have conversations that have long been had in the academy. So for many of the projects that I worked on as a curator at the Getty, I felt that in some ways, the museum was catching up to the scholarship of 30, 40, 50 years in some cases, but with a different lens, really looking at what does it mean to talk about race or gender or sexuality for a general audience, for whom the Middle Ages might mean castles, cathedrals, chronic diseases, crusades, Game of Thrones, Disney. What are those different pathways that our audiences have encountered the Middle Ages? And when you introduce a topic of race, I've had the experience of many visitors feeling that this is too current or too presentist, as we might say as historians. How can we talk about race in a pre-modern context? And that's where I think in working through the materials for the Newberry exhibition, it's been exciting to see how all of our different fields, whether library science, archives, museums, curatorial conservation, education fields, are contending with really pressing matters of the moment. I think if it's all right, Andrea, can we share some images perhaps from our
Yeah, no,
projects and
absolutely.
think through? I know we've been doing this for years now on Zoom, but I'm still always nervous to make sure everything actually shares properly. So hopefully you're now seeing our images.
Yeah.
Does that look right, Andrea? Great. So in thinking about our spaces, whether they're at the Met or the Getty Museum, where I spent some time, I wanted to start following suit with where Christopher began earlier with acknowledging the peoples of the lands on which I'm working and living. Here in Riverside, I'm surrounded by people today and communities that represent numerous indigenous nations that have been here since time immemorial, including the Tongva, the Cahuilla, the Payam Cahuichim, and others. And just yesterday, I was at an event at one of our local universities to commemorate an indigenous garden. And the reminder that we were given by elders is that our acknowledgements of land and place is a starting point. And it's a reminder that we all have a responsibility, as Christopher also mentioned, to form relationships with the people around us and to be mindful of those histories. And so I share some images on screen that I encountered in 2021 by the artist Katie Dorame, who's a local Tongva artist. And she creates what she calls California collages that reveal the layers of the land around us, and specifically the way in which indigenous land has now been supplanted by modern, Western, white settler spaces, such as the Catalina Island space at left, or the Greater Los Angeles Basin at right, with the Getty Museum as a central focal point. The gold ground paintings that are on each of these collages came from an auction catalog from 2020. These were works that I was looking at as 14th century Italian altarpiece fragments. The works were later acquired by the Louvre in Paris. And in conversations with Katie and other members of the Dorame family, they've shared the ways in which the histories of the 14th century, 13th century, and earlier in European history are so often a part of the imagination of people in the United States, even though we often overlook the histories of Native people that have always been here. And so that's long been a guiding principle, especially after interacting with curators of Indigenous art and Native communities more directly. But in terms of the projects at the Getty, one of the remarkable aspects of the Getty collection is that we have this trove of illuminated manuscripts. And due to their light-sensitive nature, we rotate them in 3 to 4 exhibitions throughout the year. And one of the pitches that I presented when I interviewed for the job was to try to situate the collection in a broader global context. And recognizing the limitations of borrowing objects from far-off places, one of the suggestions by senior curator Elizabeth Morrison was to borrow from local institutions. And that really allowed a collection of 250 or so manuscripts, leaves, and cuttings to be presented in a larger global context, effectively introducing a more robust range of objects from Africa, from Asia, from Southeast Asia, and from the Americas. And so on screen are just a few of those exhibition projects. With one of the early projects, Traversing the Globe through Illuminated Manuscripts, I was drawing on lessons that I learned as an educator at the Getty, working really with my colleague Jennifer Lee, who was an educator at the time, and our mentor Elliot Kaiki, who challenged us with the notion that are museums really spaces where people come to learn art history? Or have we as curators and scholars made art history the single guiding focus of the work of museums? And with Eliot's guidance, I remember thinking through The Object at Left, which is a prayer book of Cardinal Albert of Brandenburg from the 16th century. It was on view during my time as an educator, and something that Eliot noticed was the way in which peoples from beyond Europe were represented in these stories that are about Jerusalem, the Holy Land, the Eastern Mediterranean, and how so often those stories of Christian figures were whitewashed. And it was really helpful then to begin thinking about this notion of whitewashing, but also presenting a range of peoples, the same kinds of peoples that artists would have come into contact with. And in collaboration with colleagues like Bindu Gude at the LA County Museum of Art and Linda Komarov also at LACMA, they suggested other objects that could pair with the 16th century manuscript to similarly highlight, in this instance, stories about race. And so that's where I think one of the points that I've learned over the years is the importance of collaboration. Even as a curator, the kinds of manuscripts that I worked with represented traditions and languages that I had no real firsthand knowledge of. Overseeing a small fragment of African objects from Ethiopia or Egypt or Tunisia, I don't have the languages still to be able to read the text. And so collaboration became the vehicle for understanding that material more directly. And I just wanted to hint at an object in the Getty's collection that I've been focusing more directly on, which is the post-conquest Peruvian history of the Inca by Martín de Murúa. And this manuscript, written in Spanish, is one that's related to a larger body of manuscripts, some of which I was able to write about in a recent volume about race in the medieval and Renaissance period that I'll touch on in a second. But moving in a new direction, I've thought about my early years as a Hispanist, being trained in Spanish and Portuguese, and what it might look like to now take a new direction away from the Italian material that I know so well into the Spanish and in the indigenous languages. And so that's where I'm moving in the next several months in a fellowship in Mexico to really begin learning some of the languages from indigenous Mexico, and then next year, indigenous Peru. But I'll just say a few words about this painting then. It's one that loomed large in my knowledge as an educator at the Getty. I also thought directly about it as a graduate student working with Molly Bourne at Syracuse University. We spent lots of time in Mantua, where Andrea Mantegna, the artist of this painting, was working as the court artist. And yet something that always troubled me in reading the scholarship on this painting is that the representation of authentic or believable Chinese porcelain received extensive biographies. In addition to the patron or the possible patron of this painting, Isabella d'Este, an extremely important woman of the Renaissance, and yet too infrequently were acknowledged the histories of enslaved Black children in Isabella's court. Certainly those histories were known to scholars like Kate Lowe and Paul Kaplan and a number of others, and yet the museum had not told the story. And I remember in thinking through telling a story about the African presence in European art, based largely on the work of Janice Spicer at the Walters Art Museum, my colleague Kristen Collins and I were posing the question, how can we have conversations about race in a setting and in a museum that has not often engaged in that topic? And how to have those conversations in responsible ways so that the exhibition didn't become the only space to discuss race. That is to say, if a visitor walked into the gallery and encountered an exhibition on race, but then went through the rest of the permanent collection and saw images of people of color with no critical lens behind it, does that then do a disservice to our audiences? And yet I remember really powerfully in an email and then in a series of meetings being told by management at the museum that the masterpieces of European Renaissance art cannot become the poster children for the history of enslavement. And I remember sitting back and thinking, they already are. In fact, they already reveal those histories. We've already known this. It's nothing new. The question really becomes, can we have those honest conversations in the gallery? And can we do that in a way that is transparent with our audiences about those histories. And so we worked through a range of approaches to try to tell those stories, including having focus language in the exhibition that tried to work through some of the terms that we encounter in archives and the words that scholars have applied to these periods. When scholars use the terms servant, slave, page, or attendant to refer to Black figures, is that language of convenience, or is that language from the archives? Is that language that we use because we feel more comfortable saying servant or page versus enslaved person? That's complicated and really is region or city specific, as we learned. And yet still, I remember again in the meeting being told that we could not have this discussion in relation to the Mantegna painting. So it was sideswiped in the gallery, put off to the side. And I still struggle with that, whether we should have pushed harder. And it was also in the opening of the exhibition when colleagues of color, specifically Black colleagues, came forward and asked, what about stories of freed Black Africans in the Renaissance? You've told this great story about enslavement and about the presence of Black figures, but what about freed communities? And Kristen and I immediately realized that we missed the opportunity in the gallery to bring this painting by Vittore Carpaccio into the gallery, to actually interrogate that history of freed Black African gondoliers in the Veneto, in the Venetian lagoon, which is again indebted to research by Kate Lowe. But we also were attempting to find ways to allow Africa to speak for itself in the exhibition. And so having Ethiopian manuscripts in the show was one way to do that. We had intended a whole range of other objects from Africa, from the LA County Museum of Art and the Fowler Museum. But in another meeting with colleagues, we were asked, is the Getty the right place to tell this story? Since the Getty doesn't have a collection of African art, would we be overstepping? Would we be misrepresenting? Who are we to speak for these communities and these traditions? And so one strategy that our social media team came up with was to develop a series of blog posts about real African people, kings, rulers, diplomats, and others that would allow visitors to explore more fully the histories that were presented in the exhibition, and also to have an audio guide that had readings in the original languages and contemporary translations in Ethiopian or in the Congolese dialects, so that visitors could understand the correspondence between African kingdoms and their European counterparts. All of this resulted in the book Balthazar, A Black African King in Medieval and Renaissance Art, and it could only have come about because of the collaboration, the point that I mentioned earlier. And thank you, Andrea, for your great collaboration and piece here. I think the real joy that I found as an editor on the volume was learning from 11 different scholars who have worked in many instances more deeply on this material than either of us as editors had, and also to be able to engage contemporary art within the space of the volume in a way that we couldn't in the gallery. And so just to sort of bring us up to speed on more recent projects, working with Larissa Grollemond on a topic related to fantasy in the Middle Ages, we really also wanted to address years of social media initiatives that we had online that also resulted in gallery installations or public programs to address topics related to the Middle Ages on screen, in theater, in popular culture more broadly. And we addressed race and gender and sexuality in different sections. And it's interesting that those sections have received the most criticism from non-scholars. And having shared a lot of this material on my own social media accounts, it's this material that receives the most pushback, the most hate speech, death threats to myself and to others. And that's where I really stop and think, it is dangerous work to begin having conversations in spaces that have not been safe for these conversations, or that have perpetuated the whiteness of a space and hasn't made room for broader conversations. And so just a few days ago, I submitted a final essay to a retrospective of Kent Monkman's art that will open at Denver next year. And there I was really grateful to be challenged by the curator, John Lukovic, to think about Kent's work as a two-spirit individual in relation to broader European visual traditions that he draws from. And then with Balthazar, it was a real pleasure also to work with Carlos Motta. I'll encourage everyone to watch his video Corpo Fechado. I'll put a link in the chat later so that everyone has access to it. This video tells a powerful story of a man who lived in the 17th century, José de Pereira, and his story is told through a contemporary actor from Angola. And the words of this man's deposition from the 17th century are set against the words of Peter Damian from the 11th century and Peter the Navigator from the 16th century. And throughout the video, you see these figures of history playing chess with ideas about race and gender and sexuality set against a 16th century Portuguese map of the world. And that video itself has given such insight to me about the work that we do as historians. So much of the time, I think we assume that history is black and white or clear-cut truths and timelines, and yet a work like this reminds us of the many different voices and iterations, or the palimpsest of time that brings us to where we are in the present. And I hope that was a nice segue then into your work, Andrea, with Africa and Byzantium, because I'd love to have a conversation with you about mapping and also contemporary art, and also the terms that we use: Africa, Byzantium, medieval, Europe, and so forth.
Oh, absolutely. And before I go into some of my work at the Met and how I've been thinking about race and the Byzantine world, I just wanted to stop a moment and ask a question because that was really beautiful, Bryan, and thank you so much for that summary of the work that you're doing. But I've been really curious about the ways in which that you have engaged with the expectations of the audience, because I've been thinking about that for my work as well. Like, to what extent should we expect that the audience, know like what we're talking about, right? Or also, to what extent do we meet the audience where they are, or are we going to be like more didactic to explain these very difficult terms? So, how have you done that within your work, and how have you engaged with expectations, but then also, try to gently shift the audience to meet you where you are as well?
Yeah, it's a really good question. If I can go back for a moment, let's see, to the Andrea Mantegna. Are you seeing it on your screen, Andrea?
Yeah.
This was a painting. I remember in talking about this in one of our early exhibition planning sessions before the show was really greenlit in terms of having a date on the books. One of our exhibition coordinators, Susan McGinty, said, "Okay, wait a minute. You've told us about this Chinese porcelain cup. You've talked about enslaved children, but why is the Virgin Mary wearing a turban? And why does
Mm,
she have this Arabic script along the hem of her garments?"
mm,
And so even in that moment, I remember thinking, oh yeah, right. There's so much more to unpack in this narrative. And then later in the conversation, she said, "So wait, who's Isabella d'Este again? And why were you talking about her?" So that it just was a reminder as you're asking the question that there are often so many narratives that we're trying to unpack. And even in looking at this painting and the way it's labeled at the museum today, it talks about Andrea Mantegna, Italian Renaissance humanism, Northern court culture, but says nothing else about race or trade and luxury goods. So obviously it's a curatorial choice that's been made, but it's also making an assumption that visitors know what Italian Renaissance is, what humanism is, what a court artist is, and why Mantegna even matters.
mm,
I know one of the things that Kristen and I felt strongly about was that we wanted to try to decenter the narratives about the artists or the patrons as much as we could to allow the stories of actual Black people, kings, diplomats, and so forth to come forward. If on the one hand, to destabilize the expectations of visitors, for the visitor that might read the tombstone and see Mantegna and recognize the name, they already have a certain knowledge base that they bring to that painting. For
mm.
those for whom Mantegna would mean nothing, or would only mean something if we told them that he's the official court painter in this context, then we've given a lens that is taking away, in some cases, from the story at hand. So I mean, that is the goal of exhibitions, right?
Yeah.
Is to try to deepen an audience's understanding of whatever the topic is. And so many of the strategies that I know you've also used is using, mapping where they are, terminology and language that's familiar that we can then unpack. We recognize that, of course, what happens in the gallery on those very short labels is very different than what happens in the catalog, where the
Mm,
catalog can really go in depth about concepts of race that are succinct in the galleries. But then also, I think I've really found that contemporary art is a powerful motivator for bridging those gaps.
yeah.
If a visitor can see, wow, okay, here's this 21st century object that's helping me reimagine my own understanding of history and of art, then that's, I think, a really successful curatorial experiment or opportunity. But I don't know. I mean, it's something I struggle with as well. And hopefully we can continue to think through because I want to always push our audiences to learn something new, but
Mhm.
not to the point where they are putting up walls and don't want to hear any more.
Absolutely. I mean, it's
So.
kind of a balance because you want to challenge audiences, right? And as well, but then you also want them to feel comfortable in these spaces. And so I think that that's one of our goals as curators. But so I can talk a little bit about Africa Byzantium. So for those of you who don't know, this is an exhibition that opened at the Met in November and is traveling to Cleveland actually tomorrow. And so if you're in the Midwest, please go to Cleveland Museum of Art. But the exhibition's about the connections between North and East Africa and the Byzantine world, specifically from the 4th to the 15th century. But I started off actually with materials from the Roman period, and then I have a contemporary coda as well. And there's really fantastic loans in the exhibition from Tunisia, Egypt, and Monastery of St. Catherine of Sinai. And then we have great works of art from medieval Nubia and Ethiopia as well. One interesting thing about the exhibition is that in the exhibition itself, and at least in the Met installation, I never talk about race and ethnicity specifically, or diversity, or anything about identity. And it was really kind of tracking the visitors along the lines of the people who lived in Northern Africa and then the connections with the broader Mediterranean and the Byzantine world. But I wanted the visitors to get a sense of the diversity of the region through the artworks themselves. And so that's actually one of the reasons why I started the exhibition with this great 2nd century mosaic from the Louvre. It's a mosaic of a preparation of the feast. And people have asked me, like, well, why would you start your exhibition with this Roman mosaic? And I was like, well, this is African art, right? And so like that's one thing that I tried to do throughout the exhibition, because there's the entire exhibition had objects made in Northern Africa or Sinai. And so I was kind of challenging the visitors to kind of rethink their associations with these terms of both Africa and Byzantium. You can go to the next slide. And one issue I think with loan shows is you can't bring everything that you want, right, to an exhibition. And so that's the reason why catalogs are so exciting. And it was great to hear you, Bryan, reflect on your catalog for Balthazar, because you're able to bring in so many more narratives and stories about that topic. And same for the Africa Byzantium catalog. I was able to bring in works that I really, really wanted to bring to the exhibition, but I couldn't because of complications. So this is a really great mosaic that's in the Sousse Museum in Tunisia, and they just reinstalled it in the museum. And so in 2018, when I pitched the idea, it was on the table to come to the show. But then when I went to Tunisia in 2021, they said, well, we just reinstalled it. You can pick something else, right? But I wanted to show this mosaic to this group because Northern Africans have some of the best mosaicists in the Mediterranean and the Roman and the Byzantine periods. You get a sense of that through the exhibition, but then also in the catalog. But then there's a lot of representations of what Americans would call Black Africans and Tunisian mosaics. And their representations are figures of, this is a figure of Venus or Athena. And it's just interesting the ways in which the Northern Africans were representing different classical figures as Black. And we don't have primary source text to talk about the reasons why they did this. And so it's kind of difficult to parse out what Blackness means in Northern Africa during the Roman and late antique period, because, like, as a historian, it's really important to look at primary source text with the art, right? But then we have like this disconnect, because we see Black figures in Northern Africa, but we don't really understand the meanings of these figures. Does this represent a real Black African, or is this an ideal? And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring in this fantastic mosaic. And everyone should go to Tunisia and to the Sousse Museum, because it's actually one of my favorite museums in the entire world. And I've been actually thinking about accessibility in really interesting ways as well. And I feel like I'm an ambassador for Tunisia these days, because it's such a fantastic country with a lot of great material. Next slide. So I've been looking at to other scholars to help me with this work in terms of thinking about labels and descriptions in museum context and how to describe Blackness and for the pre-modern period. And so Sarah DeRibu, who's a professor of classics at Stanford University, wrote a really phenomenal book called Untangling Blackness in Greek Antiquity. And it's really changed the ways in which I've been thinking about the topic of Blackness. And so she, in her book, talks about these bases, and the title that you see on the bottom is the way in which Princeton University labels these bases now. Sarah suggests that we shouldn't gender the figures on the basis or racialize them. And so she suggests that we call them a Black figure with a tan figure, so not necessarily Greek or white, and just use very basic descriptions because we don't know exactly who these figures are and then what they represented for the community. And for example, with the Black figure, is this a man or is this a woman, right? We can't tell. And then you also have to think about like what kind of biases you might have as a person who's looking at this that might gender or racialize the different figures as well. And so she suggests just to remove those descriptors and use them in context and in labels. And so I've been thinking about that within my own work. And so you can go to the next slide. So these are African red silkware that was in African Byzantium, both in the catalog and then in the exhibition as well. And it was interesting when I was writing the labels for this, I thought to myself, well, there's aspects of these figures that seem, of African descent, right? Like, so if you look at the base with the head, the middle one with the person who looks like a woman, you can see like these tight curls that are locks and they almost look like ringlets, and then it seems like Black people's hair, right? And so, but I had to remove myself from the ways that I read this as a Black person and recognize that I don't know who these people are, right? And so what I ended up doing was not talking about the identities of the figures themselves, but I talked about like other things such as the importance of African red silkware and the materials and then the making themselves, and then allow the visitors just to make their own interpretations of this material. But it was interesting when I was giving tours of this, when people asked me specifically like, oh, are these Black people or are these white people? And I said, well, what is it about these bases that are making you use either terms, because the Northern Africans in the 3rd and 4th century wouldn't have considered themselves using either Blackness or whiteness. And so it was really interesting having those conversations in the galleries about these figures specifically. And the next slide. Then in the galleries, we do have representations of Black figures. And the middle textiles, I've been thinking a lot, the Black mounted riders is interesting because you have these Black figures on horses rushing across the textile. And then you also have figures of angels with these pink and white threads. And then at the very bottom is another figure of a rider. And so it's clear that the Egyptians and Northern Africans overall are thinking about difference, right? And just like that mosaic that we saw with the Black Athena and the figure that was rendered with the pink tesserae, and here you see color difference. The issue, and this is something that like a writing project I'm working on right now, is how do we kind of get to the nitty-gritty of the ways in which the late antique peoples were thinking about race, and then what sources do we need beyond these art historical sources? Because in primary text, so like in early Christian texts, there is a sense of like Blackness being evil, right? In an early Christian text, but those are very specific religious texts, and it's not necessarily primary source documents, right? And in terms of people thinking about race and ethnicity. And so I'm just going through the archive right now and trying to figure out and putting together the resources, the source material to really properly talk about this as well. But it was really fantastic to be able to bring these into the exhibition. Sarah DeRuba wrote a really fantastic article or a chapter in the exhibition catalog, and she's talked about the ways in which she's been thinking about this topic as well. Next slide. In the exhibition, there was a section about Nubia and Byzantium, and I was so thrilled to be able to have these loans from the National Museum of Warsaw. They're really interesting because they're from a cathedral, a 12th century cathedral. Well, the cathedral was in use from the 9th to the 15th century, but in Sudan. And these are really fascinating because there's representations of both Black figures and white figures, lack of a better word. But what's interesting is that we know who these figures are. right? And so, and Bryan, I talked about this figure also in the Balthazar catalog, but what's fascinating about it is that we know that in the first figure with the bishop and St. Peter, the bishop is a well-known bishop in medieval Nubia. So I'm able to really talk about him and understand like his context. And actually, and we know that he traveled around the Mediterranean world. What's interesting here is that when the visitors saw this, and at least on the tours, people asked me, well, is there a sense of hierarchy here with the white figures, like embracing the little black figures? And I wanted the visitors to kind of interrogate the ways in which they were reading this, because this is kind of like a classical protection scene that we see in medieval and Byzantine art during this time period, with a biblical figure putting his hand on a contemporary figure, right? And the quote unquote white apostle, he's not necessarily white, right? Like he's almost translucent. And he seems like, if you really, and especially if you look at him in person. So if you haven't gone to the exhibition in New York, please go to Cleveland, because you can really see that the painter wasn't creating a person. It was almost as someone who's not of this world, right? And so I think what the medieval Nubians were doing here was representing themselves, but then representing someone that was otherworldly, with these different colors. You have the white, but then there's also these greens and oranges as well. And the figures almost seem as if they're, almost like aliens, right? Like they're not a part of this world. And so it was really great to be able to kind of parse out those issues within the exhibition with visitors during the run of the exhibition. And next slide, please. And so this is just a fun shot, so you can get a sense of the scale as well. But then you can also get a sense of the ways in which the colors on both. So the second figure is Christ with the Nubian dignitary. And again, Christ almost looks translucent, like he doesn't look like a person, right? Okay, next slide. At the end of the exhibition, I had a contemporary coda. So this is not going to Cleveland. This was Met specific, but I went with two really great living artists, Teo Shettu and Sade Mekonnen. And the reason why I included these works here is not because they talked about race specifically, but they talked about their identities as Ethiopians and artists who are kind of thinking about Byzantine art within their own practice. And one thing that was really great working with Sade specifically is that she wanted to dedicate both her light sculptures and her textiles to Black women who passed away on trying to cross the Mediterranean from Northern Africa to Italy or Southern Europe. And it was really interesting to hear her reflect about dedicating these works to specifically Black people, because that's something that would be lost in the archive, right? For like, as people who are working on material where we don't know the artists, right? We don't know why things were made sometimes and who they were, the works were dedicated to. But then actually working with living artists, I was able to like ask these questions and create a new archive. And then hopefully, 1,000 years from now, we have this data, right? And we can talk about these questions about race and ethnicities in a little bit more tangible way. Okay, next slide. So Christopher, I just have a few more slides, and then I'll be ready for questions, and I'll just go through this really quickly. But the great thing about big exhibitions is that you're able to bring up these questions with lots of works from all over the world, right? And so I could get these great loans, and I could ask these questions of the materials and present them to the visitors in the catalog and then also in the exhibition. These are two works that are under my peer review at the Met and in a permanent collection, and there are only two Ethiopian works under my purview. Most of the other Ethiopian material is in the Rockefeller wing. And, there's so many stories to tell about Ethiopia within our permanent collection. And one thing that I've been grappling with as a curator is, how do I tell complex stories with two objects, right? And what do you do with that, right? And so I just want to bring this up because it's something that I've been thinking about, like beyond the exhibition, and then how do we continue this energy, right, of this interest in these topics with the permanent collection in, itself. And so, next slide. So what I've been doing is collaborating with my colleagues in the Rockefeller Ring in terms of doing long-term loans with objects from the department. And I say this, kind of a quote unquote, because the Met is a very siloed institution. I think a lot of institutions are very siloed, but we have to, write a formal loan request in order to bring objects from one space to another space. And so this is an image of where we put a case of Ethiopian and Congo material. You can go to the next slide. And so if you haven't been to the Met recently, this is actually a very old photo of back when we had crossroads, but there's this really great long sight line of processional crosses. Starting at the Byzantine apse, we have a Byzantine cross, and then we have a Spanish cross, and then there was just this empty space. And that's where I decided to put some Ethiopian crosses. And originally I was thinking about putting the Ethiopian material in the Byzantine Egyptian galleries because that's where I had African material overall. But then those Byzantine Egyptian galleries are materials from the 4th to the 7th century. And I wanted not just to put all like the Black material together, right? Like I wanted to spread it all across the medieval galleries. And so you can go to the next slide. So we put it on this the sight line. And so we could talk about, processional crosses overall, but then it also kind of gave space to this 16th to 17th century material. And this was actually interesting to put here because this is beyond the medieval period as well. And the only relationship that this material has to these galleries are the links to Christianity. Okay, you can go to the next slide. And then finally, just kind of a promotion to a show that I have up right now. It's called Afterlives, Contemporary Art in the Byzantine Crypt. And this space, as I mentioned, I have mostly 4th to 7th century materials, but they're all funerary materials from Egypt. And all the materials relate really to death and the afterlife. And so I worked with my colleague, Keene in Modern Contemporary to bring in works that reflect on grief and memory and loss overall, but almost all the works that we brought into this exhibition that are contemporary are made from people of color, the ways in which Americans describe it, or people of African descent as well. And so people have asked me, what's your next project after Africa Byzantium? I already did it. Like this is done. And I'm thinking about future projects, but these are just some shots of this installation. So I hope you come visit it the next time you're in the Met. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea.
Wow. I can just say, I think I speak for everyone here, and I see the reactions coming in, that was just an amazing sort of behind the scenes journey from both of you. So thanks very much for that. We have about 11 minutes or so kind of left for us, but anyone who's willing, Bryan, Andrea, if you're willing to sort of stick around a little bit after noon, we can take some more questions. So if you have questions out there, please do submit them through the Q&A function. This is a great opportunity to really do that. I see some hands raised, but if you could just go ahead and put the questions into the Q&A, that will help us to keep record of everything. And while people are maybe formulating some questions, I have one of my own that I'd like to share with both of you. And it comes from our experience working on our exhibition on Seeing Race Before Race last fall. And it was something that our director of exhibitions, Sarah Alvarez, said that was really stuck with me, was thinking about the exhibition, the exhibition space as part of a spectrum, and sort of thinking about how exhibitions can only accomplish so much. You can only do so much of it. And it was her encouragement to get us to think about other ways we could sort of augment the work or do other things that we wanted the exhibition to do, but not necessarily in the space. And I'm thinking, Bryan, especially your comment about how museums, libraries, different institutions can have different sort of thoughts to this process. So my question is just, I'm interested to hear you guys think about sort of the other types of things on the spectrum that can help to sort of do the work that you guys have tried to accomplish in gallery spaces, perhaps even to in some ways deal with resistance or difficulty you might find in sort of the actual space itself, like what you can and can't say or what you can and can't show. So any thoughts you guys have on that? I would love to hear them.
Yeah, I can just start thinking about Africa Byzantium because, I think one critique of the show is that I didn't talk about everything, right? And I kept having to say, like, this is an exhibition itself is not a book, right? And the catalog is based on the objects that you're able to bring in an exhibition. And exhibitions overall are so object focused, right? And so you have to tell the story based on the objects that you have. And so how I try to kind of build on that spectrum is through community engagement work. And so the Ford Foundation funded a series of community conversations leading up to the exhibition and after the exhibition itself to engage different communities and to think about the stakes of this idea, the connections between Africa, Byzantium, and how it relates to them today. And so I wanted to do that, not only because it's important for me to bring the past into the present, but then also teach a broader audience like these things that our field already knows, right? But like kindergarteners might not know, fifth graders, the guy who lives in Brooklyn might not know this, right? And so I was thinking, like, how can I bring in more people who usually don't feel comfortable coming into the Met and opening up the space for them, but then also teaching them something that's really new for them, and also creating a space where they can feel challenged, but then also think more about the possibilities of these ideas.
Yeah, I agree, Andrea, with what you're saying. And I was thinking as you were speaking, but also as Christopher was asking the question, trying to create that sense of consistency across an institution, because again, it's one thing if you're doing this work under your purview, but if it's not happening in other areas of the collection, it can be really jarring for a visitor as they're wandering around thinking, wait a minute, I just saw this really incredible exhibition that helped me rethink this moment, but then I've gone back to the permanent collection and I don't see any of that material reflected, right? I mean, I think that was the concern that I had in thinking through Balthazar is we do this great work with community engagement. And I see Jesse Park's question about, did we have an advisory committee? We did for Balthazar. It was really great. Both paid colleagues that consulted on the show, Tyree Boyd Pates and Bryant Marks and several others, but then also working with our staff on the ground, with the education department, the exhibitions team, the registrars, the designers, and really ensuring that they have a place to bring their voices to the galleries. I think it was the designers who rightly said, gosh, you're having too many objects. This story is now too complicated. Can you narrow it down? But then it was also in working with curatorial assistants who said, wait a minute, you focus so much on Blackness, but you haven't told us about the anachronistic whiteness of some of the figures. So it was, I think all along was important to think, okay, we wanted to tell this story about Blackness because we realized that was a story most visitors did not know. But in doing that, we might have otherwise missed the opportunity if we didn't have those bigger conversations to address the anachronistic whiteness. So I think it's been a constant learning process. But as you said, Andrea, trying to have enough robust programming so that the exhibition can speak to many different kinds of visitors, the visitors who might come to a concert or public program or scholarly lecture, symposium, study day, family tour, workshop. And then I think as well, the Met has done a great job with incorporating the contemporary so that it feels like we also as visitors have a view, a voice that is valid, just as the artists that we're seeing around us.
Absolutely. And then just to kind of pick up on Jesse's question, and then the second question as well, in terms of advisory committees, like we also had an scholarly advisory committee and a community advisory committee as well. And both of those committees helped with the checklist, but then also the narratives, thinking about programming, but then also thinking about sustainable partnership. So one thing that I didn't want to do with Africa Byzantium was have this only be like a 3-6 month installation and then the community forgets about it or we forget about the community. Like I know these things live on and catalogs and scholars continue to think about it, but I wanted to think like what would it mean to grow with the communities that we basically developed in the course of the project. And so the community advisory committee has really helped me to think about what does this relationship look like in 5 years from now, and then what does that community need from us in order to like make it feel like a mutual sustainable partnership. And so that means continued programs, continued like educational opportunities, continued advice from them, in terms of looking at labels in a permanent collection, and then continue conversations about like my acquisitions in the future. And so I've been thinking a lot about how to, harness this energy from the exhibition and make it sustainable long term overall. And so I think that kind of answers the questions in terms of thinking about how reaching out to new audiences beyond the exhibition.
Great. Yeah, I think you guys are so efficient how you can actually answer both of the first two questions. But I think a lot really some really wonderful stuff there, and that right, you want people to keep coming back and hopefully still continue to have these experiences in your spaces. We have another question from Tom Dale that is an important one here. So, and it's mostly for you, Andrea, but we're happy to hear your thoughts, Bryan, as well, about he's curious about the absence of race as a question in the African and Byzantium exhibition. I understand the desire not to anachronistically project our ideas of race into the late antique and medieval past, and I appreciate having an exhibition highlight the diversity of distinct cultures in pre-modern Africa. But we are increasingly learning how so many of our attitudes, so many genealogies of racialization are rooted in the ancient and medieval past. So the example of the Ethiopian being such a significant trope, going back to Herodotus, I was glad to hear you mention Peter Damian, Bryan. That's been one of my favorite instances where the Black Ethiopian shows up in a very negative context. So Andrea, if you could sort of unpack that, or if a larger question for Bryan too, like what are the challenges of trying to bring out this language in a way that it's not going to immediately get people's guards up and keep them from engaging?
No, absolutely. And so Sarah DeRiver wrote, a really great essay in the Africa Byzantium catalog dealing with race and some of these questions. And it was just one of those decisions not to talk about it because there's so many other stories to talk about. And for this exhibition, it was a complicated exhibition. And even in terms of the themes and the regions and the types of people that we tried to highlight in the exhibition, it for some visitors was actually confusing, right? And so we did have to make a choice of like what we would talk about and what might be distracting. And so I always say, the exhibition is not a book. And I think if I wrote a book about Africa Byzantium, I obviously would have talked about race. And actually, as I mentioned, I have a big file of notes and different ideas about this very topic about race and the Byzantine world. I'm actually writing a chapter for Cambridge history right now, specifically about that. And I'm able to talk about those things because I can use literature and then texts that don't look pretty, so don't need to display them, right? And then other things that you wouldn't necessarily display in an exhibition. But I think that if I talked about basically everything that Tom Dale mentioned on a label, it would have been confusing to people, and I would have had the opportunity to flesh it out. However, I do think that one thing I could have done, and I still have opportunity to do it, we could have a panel about this, and where scholars talk about this specifically and how they're engaging with their work with like maybe thinking about a few objects. And so that's something that I could do in the future.
That sounds
Great.
Mhm.
Andrea solved it. Well done. Just another question. Susan J. Noakes just was. It's more of just a FYI. A film debuting at the Venice Biennale in August, working title "We Were Here" by Fred Cawarno and Lorenzo Fabri, focusing on Africans in Renaissance art. Both creators are very mindful of contemporary African migration to Italy. So I don't know if either of you are familiar with that, but if not, everyone now is. So thank you very much for bringing that to our attention.
Thank you, Professor Noakes. Yes, I think I was just sent it by another colleague just a few days ago. In fact, so thank you. Yes, looking forward to seeing it.
Then we'll have to have another conversation to talk about it.
And I'm looking forward to seeing it. I can't wait to get to Venice.
All right. Well, we are at 1 o'clock. I think we could go on for a very long time with all of us, with all of this, but I want to be respectful to everyone's time. So please, those of you who are still here, please join me in thanking Andrea and Bryan for a truly illuminating conversation. This was a really, really spectacular dive into the ways in which curators have to think about race and all the different challenges and opportunities for that. So thank you for precisely delivering what we hoped this conversation would. I just want to say a little bit here, just to round out about what's coming up next. This was our final meeting of the Race and Dialogue series for this year. But if you'll just give me a second to share my screen. I want to thank everybody for joining us and point out that there is more Race and Dialogue to come in the next year. So you can find, there will be a recording of this session and a recording of all of the previous conversations that we have had on our YouTube channel, the Center for Renaissance Studies YouTube channel. There's the link there, so you can take a screenshot or just look for us on YouTube. Stay tuned. We will be announcing our programming series for next year in the coming months, but we will have some more conversations to come, which we hope will be just as enriching and enlightening as this one was. So once again, thank you, Bryan. Thank you, Andrea, for sharing your expertise and your time with us. And thanks to all of you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you all again in the next year.